Right, we now come to the statement. I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Right Honourable Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Prime Minister set out the action we need to take between now and the start of December to control the spread of coronavirus. In response, we're providing significant extra support to protect jobs and livelihoods in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. An extension to the coronavirus job retention scheme. More generous support to the self-employed and paying that support more quickly. Cash grants of up to £3,000 per month for businesses which are closed, worth over £1 billion every month. £1.6 billion for English councils to support their local economy and local healthcare response. Longer to apply for our loan schemes and the Future Fund. The chance to top up bounce-back loans and an extension to the mortgage payment holidays. All on top of more than £200 billion of fiscal support since March. This statement follows the Bank of England's monetary policy decisions earlier today, meaning all economic and monetary institutions are playing their part. As you would expect, the Governor and I are in constant communication as the situation evolves. Our responses are carefully designed to complement each other and provide certainty and support to people and businesses across the UK. The bank's forecasts this morning show economic activity is supported by our substantial fiscal and monetary policy action. And the IMF just last week described the UK's economic plan as aggressive, unprecedented, successful in holding down unemployment and business failures, and one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. Mr. Speaker, our highest priority remains the same: to protect jobs and livelihoods. That's why we've already decided to extend the job retention scheme to December. But people and businesses will want to know what comes next, how long we plan to keep the scheme open, and on what terms. They want certainty. The government's intention is for the new health restrictions to remain only until the start of December. But as we saw from the first lockdown, the economic effects are much longer lasting for businesses and areas than the duration of any restrictions. And as the Bank of England have said this morning, the economic recovery has slowed, and the economic risks are skewed to the downside. Given this significant uncertainty, a worsening economic backdrop, and the need to give people and businesses security through the winter, I believe it is right to go further. So we can announce today that the furlough scheme will not be extended for 1 month. It will be extended until the end of March. The government will continue to help pay people's wages up to 80% of the normal amount. All employers will have to pay for hours not worked is the cost of employer NICs and pension contributions. We'll review the policy in January to decide whether economic circumstances are improving enough to ask employers to contribute more. Of course, as the furlough itself is now being extended to the end of March, the original purpose of the job retention bonus to incentivise employers to keep people in work until the end of January obviously falls away. Instead, we will redeploy a retention incentive at the appropriate time. And for self-employed people, I can confirm the next income support grant, which covers the period November to January, will now increase to 80% of average profits, up to £7,500. Mr. Speaker, I also want to reassure the people of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The furlough scheme was designed and delivered by the Government of the United Kingdom on behalf of all the people of the United Kingdom, wherever they live. That has been the case since March, it is the case now, and will remain the case until next March. It is a demonstration of the strength of the Union. And an undeniable truth of this crisis: we have only been able to provide this level of economic support because we are a united kingdom. And I can announce today that the upfront guaranteed funding for the devolved administrations is increasing from £14 billion to £16 billion. This Treasury is, has been, and will always be the Treasury for the whole of the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, I know that people watching at home will have been frustrated by the changes the government has brought in during the past few weeks. I have had to make rapid adjustments to our economic plans as the spread of the virus has accelerated. So I'd like to take this opportunity to explain how and why this has happened. During the summer, as we began slowly unlocking, it was our hope the country would continue to be economically open, albeit with local restrictions being put in place as and when needed. We knew there would likely be a resurgence in the spread of the virus, but with increased NHS capacity and test and trace, our belief was we would be able to stay ahead of the virus. On this basis, we designed an economic approach which continued providing wage support to people, incentivised businesses to retain staff beyond the end of the furlough scheme, and created new job creation and training schemes such as Kickstart, all built to support an economy that was broadly open but operating with restrictions and overall lower demand. At the time, this approach was not government acting alone. Our proposals secured wide-ranging support from the TUC to the CBI. It was their hope, as it was ours, that the public health situation would allow us to keep businesses and workplaces open. The virus, however, continued to spread. Localised restrictions were having an impact, and so we intensified this approach and added further areas. As these restrictions intensified, the economic impact, particularly on industries such as the hospitality sector, was significant. So, in response, we altered our approach to wage support, making it much more generous to employers and, in turn, protecting jobs. We also introduced a range of grants to businesses, whether open or closed, to help them meet their fixed costs, and additional funding for local authorities to respond to specific local economic challenges. But again, the virus continued to spread, but more quickly. And so we arrive at last week, when the government's scientific and medical advisors presented data which showed that R is greater than 1 in all parts of the country, that the NHS was at risk of being overwhelmed in a matter of weeks, and the likely resultant loss of life that would accompany such an event. The only viable solution left to protect our NHS was the reimposition of temporary, significant enhanced restrictions in England, in addition to those in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And so, given these changed public health restrictions and the economic trauma they would cause in job losses and business closures, I felt it best to extend the furlough scheme rather than transition at that precise moment to the new job support scheme. Now, political opponents have chosen to attack the government for trying to keep the economy functioning and to make sure the support we provide encourages people to keep working. And they will now, no doubt, criticise the government on the basis we have had to change our approach. But to anyone in the real world, that's just the thing you have to do when the circumstances change. We all hope for the best, but make sure we plan for any eventuality. We can reintroduce the furlough now only because we kept the system on which it is based operational, because there was always the possibility that we would be back in this situation. I'll leave it to the people of this country to decide whether they believe the government is trying its best to support people through an unprecedented crisis, to decide whether it is a good or bad thing to alter our economic plans as the health restrictions we face change. What I know is that the support we are providing will protect millions of jobs. What I know is that it is never wrong to convey confidence in this country and our economy through our words and action. And what I know is today's announcement will give people and businesses up and down our country immense comfort over what will be a difficult winter. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor and Lee Stoltz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Businesses and workers have been pleading for certainty from this government, but the Chancellor keeps ignoring them until the last possible moment after jobs have been lost and businesses have gone bust. The national lockdown was announced on Saturday, many weeks after both SAGE and Labour called for a circuit breaker. The Chancellor ridiculed those proposals for a shorter, more effective circuit breaker as a blunt instrument. Just a moment ago, he argued that it was only last week when the government's scientific and medical advisers presented data showing the NHS was at risk of being overwhelmed. SAGE presented that evidence, Mr. Speaker, on the 21st of September. So I'll give him the chance now to correct the record and state that actually the government knew about that evidence many weeks ago rather than last week. He can intervene on me if he wishes to correct the record. No, he hasn't done that. That delay in implementing those measures, we know, has cost livelihoods and lives. Now, when the lockdown was announced, the Prime Minister said furlough would be extended for a month, 5 hours before that scheme was due to end. 2 days later, realising the self-employed had been forgotten, there was a last-minute change to the self-employed scheme. And now, further changes. The Chancellor's fourth version of his winter economy plan in just 6 weeks. The Chancellor can change his mind at the last minute, Mr. Speaker, but businesses can't. We need a Chancellor who's in front of the problems we face, not one who's always a step behind. Hospitality workers in the north, until last Saturday, had to plan on the basis that they would receive 2/3 of their previous income. 2/3, not for so many 80%, or indeed 93%, I think it was the Prime Minister said, but 80% for huge numbers of them because of this government's failure to fix flaws in the social security system. The Chancellor said no to those hospitality workers, only to accept their demands today. The First Minister of Wales, ahead of announcing a fire break, made workable requests that could have offered support for Welsh workers. Again, the Chancellor said no, only to U-turn now. Labour argued that Scotland should have access to the furlough scheme, should there need to be a national lockdown north of the border. Once again, the Chancellor said no. Then the Prime Minister, of course, said yes. Cue another undignified scramble to accept that demand today. How many jobs could have been saved if this government had recognised reality and let businesses plan for the future? Will the Chancellor apologise to those who've already been made redundant because of this last-minute approach? Now, earlier this week, I called on the Chancellor to use the moment of the national lockdown to set out a proper plan for the next 6 months. Finally, today, he's indicated that furlough will remain for lockdown areas until March, as Labour called for. And of course that's welcome, but many other questions remain. When will the Chancellor deliver any information about that retention incentive after Labour's been warning for months that it was poorly targeted? By the time we get to March, it'll be a whole year since the first economic support package, but there's still nothing in the Chancellor's remarks for those people who've been excluded from government schemes until now. What does the Chancellor say to those groups? Will we be facing another scramble before the end of March? Can he guarantee we'll avoid such uncertainty then? Dependent, of course, on the health circumstances. Other countries seem to be able to plan for the future. Why can't this one? What's the future of the phantom funding formula, providing a seemingly arbitrary £20 a head to local areas under tiered restrictions for business support? How long will that support last? What happens when it runs out? When will he fix social security so it stops penalising the self-employed, homeowners and huge numbers of other workers facing hardship because of problems that could be fixed quickly? What is his government doing to rectify the problems with the £500 self-isolation payment so that they actually receive it, workers receive it when they need it and aren't pushed into debt for doing the right thing? And above all, when will his government enable all local areas to deliver the test, trace and isolate system when we know this is more effective than the enormously expensive national outsourced system. The Chancellor needs to stop blaming our NHS, as he appeared to do a moment ago, when it's his government that's still blocking local areas in lower tiers from delivering a more effective service. Our economy is struggling more, Mr Speaker, I'm finishing now, much more than many other countries, because this government simply won't acknowledge that until it gets a grip on the health crisis, it won't be able to deal with our economic crisis. Confidence is indeed key, and that's what this government needs to start delivering. Thank you.
Can I just say to people, we don't have interventions in statements. So if you're wondering why the Chancellor didn't, it's because we don't. No problem at all. I'm just trying to be helpful. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions. And to address them in turn, Mr Speaker, I think the claim that our action was too late is, in the words of the government's own medical advisers, a misapprehension, because there is no perfect moment at which to enact measures which have far-reaching and damaging consequences for the people and businesses of our country. And we should only enact such measures, Mr Speaker, when it becomes truly unavoidable. Mr Speaker, it is also entirely false of the party opposite to claim that if we only did what they suggested, things would somehow be different. This is because the party opposite couldn't actually explain what their position was. At first, it was a circuit breaker for 2 weeks. Then it was an intervention that might last longer. I think we heard yesterday 3 weeks. And then it might be something that would need to be reimposed again and again and again. That, Mr Speaker, is not a plan that would support the businesses and people of this country. The Honourable Lady asked about the NHS. We have provided the NHS with tens of billions of pounds to make sure that they can do the very valuable job that they are doing, and they will have our full support over this difficult winter period. She asked about support for local authorities. We have provided just over £1 billion to give local authorities the ability to support their local businesses and economies through the winter period, on top of the direct support that those closed businesses will receive. And she asked about supporting local track and trace efforts, and I agree that is important, and that is why we have provided, on a transparent funding formula, almost up to £500 million to local authorities to so ensure that they can carry out enforcement, compliance and local contact tracing at the level that they need. But, Mr Speaker, the honourable member opposite called for a 6-month plan, but yet she and her party have not put forward a 6-month plan of their own. But, Mr Speaker, I understand why. Because they actually know, as most members of this House know, that most people and businesses in this country know, that we are dealing with a once-in-a-century event. Because they know, as most members of this House know, and people and businesses up and down the country know, that in the face of such an unprecedented crisis, the government must be flexible to ever-changing circumstances. It is not a weakness, Mr Speaker, to be agile and fast-moving in the face of a crisis, but rather a strength, and that will not change.
We now go down to Central Devon to the Chair of the Select Committee. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I just agree with my right honourable friend that taking an iterative approach to these problems as circumstances change is indeed a strength rather than a weakness. But could I just focus for a moment on the lockdown itself? And as my right honourable friend will know, the minutes of the SAGE meeting held on the 21st of September stated, and I quote, "Policymakers will need to consider the analysis of economic impacts and the associated harms alongside this epidemiological assessment. This work is underway under the auspices of the Chief Economist." As my right honourable friend knows, I wrote to him asking that the analysis referred to in these minutes should be provided prior to the vote on lockdown that was held in the House yesterday. This would have helped to have informed that debate. The reply I received did not provide the information requested. So could my right honourable friend confirm that the SAGE minutes are accurate when they state that the Treasury has worked on this analysis under the auspices of its Chief Economist? And if they are accurate, would my right honourable friend confirm that the Treasury will now release this analysis without delay?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he will know that I replied to him and his committee with the answers to his question that there does not exist a specific prediction or forecast, which I think is what he is asking. But what we did provide, and I'd say the economic evidence that we considered, was the context for the lockdown being imposed and the impact that the initial lockdown has already had, so one could make their own assumptions about what would happen thereafter. He will know as well as I know the OBR are one of our preeminent forecasters, and what they are forecasting already is that the economy falls by about 10% this year, that unemployment reaches 12%, an increase of 2.5 million people, and that in the medium term our economy will suffer scarring of about 3%, which represents tens of billions of pounds of less economic output, and indeed he will of course also know the impact this is having on our public finances. That is the situation as it exists today before we enter the new set of restrictions. Obviously that will cause additional stress on all the numbers that I outlined for him. He will also have seen the Bank of England's comments this morning that the duration of further restrictions will increase their impact of long-term scarring on the economy.
Video link. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much. I'm tempted to read out the comments I made on Tuesday, or indeed any of the contributions I've made in the last 6 months, because it feels like I've been arguing for exactly the same things for the UK government all this time. And the reality is that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the north of England have been dinghied by this Chancellor until he was forced to lock down in England. Now, I'm glad that furlough and the self-employment support scheme has been extended to March, but we should be clear that this kind of support is not unique to the UK, and countries of all sizes have been supporting their people, and many of them have done it more competently and more generously than the UK. Can he confirm that the furlough scheme is not tied to any particular tier and it will be available to all who need it at 80%? And would he refrain from cutting it back to 60% as before, because that cost many businesses and many employees dearly? Many businesses are as good as closed, especially in hospitality and tourism, travel, events and culture, and they need ongoing support. I return to the issue of the excluded from the support schemes, and it's disgraceful and it's unacceptable that there is still nothing in this statement for them after 8 months. Can the Chancellor tell me why he is still choosing to ignore 3 million people across these islands? Many sectors of the economy in which they work are not going back to normal anytime soon. I spoke to Scottish hospitality reps this morning, and they are deeply worried about the winter months ahead. They're increasingly indebted, and 70 to 100,000 jobs are at risk. It would help them immensely if the VAT cuts that the Chancellor had previously announced could be made permanent. I welcome the additional £2 billion for Scotland, because Scotland's been able to provide hospitality businesses with rates relief, but we need clarity on the future longer-term funding to plan ahead. A growing number of businesses cannot afford to pay for redundancies should they go bust. So what provision is the Chancellor making for supporting those who may yet lose their jobs as businesses go to the wall? Will he extend the £20 uprating of universal credit into the year ahead as well? Will he expand it to legacy benefits, because those in legacy benefits are really struggling? Will he enhance statutory sick pay, and will he listen to Maternity Action and Pregnant Then Screwed on their demands for women to be kept safe and their incomes protected? This has been a complete buruk, but it doesn't need to be. Will the Chancellor work with all parties and with the devolved institutions? And at the very least, could he give the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in Scotland, Kate Forbes, the courtesy of a phone call?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm glad the Honourable Lady welcomed the extension of job support through to next year. And with regards to Scotland, I think it's clear that even the First Minister has conceded that this generous support currently available in Scotland is only possible and affordable because we have a Treasury that represents the whole of the United Kingdom. I can confirm that, of course, the CGRS is a UK-wide scheme, and we will continue to apply the furlough to each part of the UK equally, treating every citizen, no matter which region of the nation they live in, the same. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady also asked some specific questions. I'm happy to provide her with the answers. Scotland will receive an upfront guarantee today worth £8 billion. That's an increase of £1 billion on the previously agreed upfront guarantee. And it's that funding, Mr. Speaker, for the Scottish Government to use as they see fit. So the Honourable Lady asked many questions about supporting businesses and people. It is, of course, up to the Scottish Government to make those choices, to what to do with our extra £1 billion, and we will look forward to hearing what they do plan to do with that additional funding. And it's also worth bearing in mind, as we hear from the Honourable Lady about the future Scottish budget, that the Scottish Government has the ability to raise taxes. The Scottish Government has the ability to raise the funds it needs to fund the various projects that they would like to. And if these things are important, then of course the Scottish Government will be able to make those decisions on behalf of their people and be held accountable for those.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for demonstrating the strength of the Union and showing that with the best will in the world, the Scottish Government would not have the ability to have the resources to protect Scottish jobs in this way. But is it not now more important than ever that across the whole of the United Kingdom we stimulate wealth creation, creating new goods and services using the natural creativity and innovation of all the people of the United Kingdom? And can we look forward to my right honourable friend using his considerable energy to bring forward proposals in this area based on sound, financially prudent Conservative principles?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend, and I absolutely agree, and he knows better than most the power of the Union and has seen it demonstrated countless times over the years of his service. And he is also right about the power of free enterprise to drive our recovery, and I can give him every reassurance that those sound free enterprise principles will be at the heart of everything that we do and ensure that we have a swift and generous recovery that will benefit citizens wherever they live.
Video link. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor's U-turn on furlough comes after intense lobbying by the TUC, the CBI, Labour and leaders in the Liverpool City region. Can the Chancellor explain why workers in the North were expected to get by on 67% of their pre-crisis wages when Tier 3 restrictions were put in place, but that has now changed to 80% once areas in the south of the country are being locked down? And will he give a cast-iron guarantee to the people in Wirral West that workers in the North will never again be treated as second-class citizens?
Mr. Speaker, it's simply not the case that the wage support schemes we've put in place differentiate between people on the basis of where they live. All the schemes, whether it's the furlough scheme or the job support scheme, treat people equally wherever they live, in every region or nation of the UK. To suggest otherwise is simply wrong, and quite frankly, a misrepresentation of what the Honourable Lady knows to be the case. I would also say to her, she mentioned the TUC. The TUC welcomed the introduction of the job support scheme, and I'm grateful to their help in designing it.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Last week, the IMF singled out for praise the UK's response to economic response to the coronavirus, citing the timeliness, the speed of response, the generosity and the flexibility of the approach. And I quote, the Director General said, "We welcome the continuing efforts of the government to refine its support measures." Does my right honourable friend also agree to the second part of what the IMF said last week, that over the medium to long term we do need to put the UK public finances back on a sustainable footing?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and she will of course know this well from her own experience. And we welcome the independent scrutiny of institutions like the IMF. They are helpful in providing accountability for the government in its economic response, and I'm delighted they were so positive about what we have done. But she is also right that they said correctly that over the medium term we must restore public finances to a sustainable position. Now is the time to provide fiscal support through a very weak period, but we want to build resilience for future crises, so when the next one of these comes along, we can respond in the same strong and generous way that we have been able to this time.
Video link. Alex Davis-Jones.
Diolch, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to see the Chancellor finally in his place today, but for constituents of mine in Pontypridd and for everyone across Wales, his words are a case of it's too little and too late. I'm aware that the UK Government has confirmed that devolved administrations will receive Barnett consequentials in respect of new funding. However, I know from experience that people in Wales cannot and should not rely on yet another promise from this UK Government. The Chancellor will also be aware that this is not the first time that funding has been promised to the people in Pontypridd. I would like to take this opportunity to remind him of the devastating flooding that decimated communities across Rhondda and Taff earlier this year, and it would be most irresponsible of this government and utterly unfair for people in Wales if they are left behind once again. This government has already blocked the Welsh Government from using both the coronavirus job retention scheme and the job support scheme, and businesses in Wales are suffering now. So will the Chancellor therefore finally commit to fair funding for people in Wales, and will he agree to meet with me and fellow MPs who represent Rhondda and Taff to allow our constituents the best possible chance as we move through the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd say to the Honourable Lady that I'm glad that over 10,000 of her constituents have had their jobs supported by the furlough scheme that the UK Government has provided. And I'm also glad to say that the Welsh Government will now have received £5 billion in upfront funding guarantees for Barnet, £600 million more and as a result of announcements today. And I'm sure she can talk to the Welsh Government about how they plan to use that money to support her constituents.
Rick Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement this morning, measures that will protect jobs and livelihoods both through this lockdown and give businesses, as they plan for 2021 and beyond, real hope and confidence that there are better days ahead. And with that in mind, does my right honourable friend agree with me and the Bank of England, whose forecasts this morning have shown economic activity in the UK is being supported by our substantial fiscal and monetary policy action, and their assessment that the extended coronavirus job retention scheme will mitigate significantly the impact of weaker economic activity in the labour market?
I thank my honourable friend for the question, and he's absolutely right. It's important for monetary and fiscal policy to be coordinated well, as he said, and I'm glad that we are achieving that. And it's also good to see the Bank of England recognising what the IMF and the Office for Budget Responsibility have also highlighted, is that our interventions in the labour market, our furlough scheme and others, have succeeded in suppressing the rise of unemployment, and that will remain our single overriding goal, to keep people in work.
Video link. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Chancellor told us in a statement that people and businesses want to know what comes next, how long we plan to keep the scheme open and on what terms. They want certainty. They certainly do. And that is why businesses and individuals in my constituency of Edinburgh West and across this country are so tired of this constant chop and change. So will the Chancellor today admit that what he has to do is extend furlough through to the summer, to June of 2021, and give those businesses the certainty they need to plan?
Well, Mr Speaker, we've provided that certainty through to the end of spring, at the same time as also saying that we will review the scheme in January to make sure that it's operating well, and at that point review the employer contribution. Combined with all the other interventions we've made, I think that does provide the medium-term certainty that businesses need to plan through the winter and beyond.
Catherine Fletcher.
Yeah. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pretty awed, to be honest, by just the incredible scale of the support that this government is putting in place for the people of South Ribble and beyond. We've got a massive recovery to undertake, where those jobs and employment, it's absolutely vital. There is £2 billion being invested in Kickstart, creating opportunities for people leaving education. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that prioritising help for these people, young workers, such as those leaving Runshaw College in Leyland, is the right thing to do and a key part of how we're going to recover?
Yeah. My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is young people that are most impacted economically by the crisis we're experiencing, and she's absolutely right that they should be at the heart of our thinking about the recovery. The Kickstart scheme is at the centre of that, providing fully funded job placements for at-risk young people. Tens of thousands are starting their jobs in the coming days and weeks, and we look forward to those young people having a new springboard to a bright career in her constituency and elsewhere.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for what he has said today? the equality for all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, whether you're in Edinburgh or Cardiff or London or Belfast, you're treated equally, and that's good news. Can I just ask, in relation to the Northern Ireland Assembly, who's been in a circuit breaker for the last 2 weeks, that the help will be, as the Chancellor said, right through until March, but should it go beyond that, it's very important to have that in place. And could the Chancellor state what support will be given to businesses? A specific question here, that have recently been set up but have been excluded from the financial support schemes and are under extreme pressure for their very survival. It's good to hear that the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has been treated equally, but it's also good to have something for those small companies I've just set up. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can confirm that all our job schemes work on a UK-wide basis, treating everyone equally wherever they live, and that will continue always to be the case. I'm also pleased to confirm today an increase in the upfront funding guarantee for Barnet Consequential to Northern Ireland, bringing the total to £2.8 billion, a £400 million increase today, and I'm sure the Northern Ireland Executive can use that funding to support businesses in the way that the Honourable Member describes.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the support that we have received? In Aberconwy, 8,800 jobs have been protected through the Job Retention Scheme. Across Wales, 82,000 self-employed people have also been supported. Indeed, across Scotland, Northern Ireland and the whole of Wales, there has been unprecedented levels of support through schemes, through Barnet Consequentials and more throughout this pandemic. So could my right honourable friend just confirm again that this House stands for the whole of the United Kingdom, that it's our shared markets and economy, strong economy, that makes this level of support possible, and that all parts of our union will continue to receive the attention and support of our government?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend put it incredibly well. This has been a crisis that has engulfed our entire United Kingdom, and we will get through it together as one United Kingdom, and this government will continue to support businesses and people wherever they live.
Video link. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Whilst I'm disappointed that there was no mention of those who have been excluded so far, I welcome much of what the Chancellor has said, particularly in relation to the devolved nations. However, when I asked just 2 weeks ago for greater flexibility for the Welsh Government to support jobs during its firebreak, that support was not forthcoming. Greater Manchester and other parts of the north of England received a similar response. So could I ask the Chancellor if he and the government realise that pitting areas of the UK against each other only serves to damage the integrity of the United Kingdom, and I urge him to recognise the need for equity across the Union.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is equity across the Union. I thank the honourable gentleman for welcoming the measures, but there is equity because everyone is treated exactly the same under these nationwide schemes. With regard to support in Wales, as I said, £600 million more announced today for the Welsh Government, bringing the total up to £5 billion of funding. And again, I'm sure the Welsh Government can use that money in the way that he suggests to support businesses if that's indeed what they want to do.
Jonathan Gallas.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I also add my name to the long list of people who are thanking my honourable friends' unprecedented support once again, which will be a great source of comfort to the residents of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torque. And may I raise the fact there is a financial incentive, not just through the Kickstart scheme for the under-25s, but now a financial incentive for the over-25s when it comes to apprenticeships, which will be a huge boost to the jobs and economic recovery of Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. And so will he agree with me that this type of scheme is exactly the way forward and that employers should be taking it up to ensure that we can reskill and retrain what is, in Stoke-on-Trent, sadly, a workforce that is largely low-skilled and therefore stuck in some cases, low-wage jobs?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. For, I think, almost the first time, there is now a cash incentive for businesses to take older apprentices on, given the particular nature of this crisis we face. I'm glad that that will help train and reskill people in his constituency. I hope many of them find their way to the world-beating ceramics industry that he champions so well, who I know will also be heartened by the extension of the furlough scheme today.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor is right. The strength of our union comes when we are working together. And yet the reality in the delay in announcing the extended support for Wales means that jobs were lost when all the Welsh Government were doing was following the evidence. And the Chancellor said it was a strength to act in an agile and fast-moving way. That's exactly what they were doing. And he also described in his own statement, his own words, that extended restrictions were the only viable option. So will he now do the right thing in the interests of the Union, in the interest of fairness, in the interest of equity, and backdate the extended support to the 23rd of October and allow those who lost their jobs potentially to be rehired and then furloughed?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. What I can tell him is the new CJRS date for eligibility will be the 30th of October, which means that those who are notified to HMRC at any point up to that time will be eligible to be furloughed under the new scheme. And indeed, those that were let go before the announcement of the plans in September can also be rehired and put back on the scheme. The details of that are in the guidance, which will be published imminently.
Video link. Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend on behalf of the 1,900 self-employed people of Darlington who have benefited from the self-employed income scheme and who will welcome his announcement today. But can I urge him to ensure that this money gets out of the door as quickly as possible, particularly with Christmas just around the corner?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. Those are 3-month grants for the self-employed. The system will open in November so that grants can be paid in December in time for Christmas, as he says. And as he knows, that builds on our significant support for the self-employed. Over 3 million people eligible for that support, which is now worth over £14 billion. Today's announcement will mean an additional £7 billion of support to those people over the Christmas period.
Video link. Hannah Bardell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My constituent Douglas McCarthy has been running a bespoke travel business, Travel Yard, for many years and has seen his livelihood completely evaporate. Despite the fact he's been bringing folk home and providing a vital service in the community, he feels that his industry has been virtually ignored by the UK government and the insurance sector, who are failing to pay out on his business interruption insurance. In addition to the uncertainty over UK government support, my constituent has had to fulfil full refunds out of his own pocket with very little support. So will the Chancellor or someone from his team meet with my constituent and I to hear the specific concerns and what can be done to support him and travel agents like him?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, travel agents, businesses coming under the retail category will benefit from business grants in England, and that money has been barneted to Scotland, and so the Scottish Government can choose to do something similar to support their travel agents. And my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, has previously worked with the insurance industry and the FCA to provide clarified and updated guidance for business interruption insurance.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Will the Chancellor now admit that his premature wind down of furlough, which he had scheduled to finish last weekend in the middle of what many people expected to be a second wave, was actually a mistake? Will he admit that the virus doesn't conform to Treasury models or the Chancellor's own timetable for it to disappear? And will he continue to show flexibility, and will he just confirm, for the avoidance of doubt, that if the current lockdown ends on the 2nd of December, that the furlough scheme will be still available to all across the country, whatever tier of restrictions they are put back in?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can give the honourable lady that assurance. The CJRS has been extended to the end of March for all people in the United Kingdom, not dependent on the tiers. We will review in January whether it is appropriate at that point to ask employers to start making a contribution as the economy recovers, but we will make that decision in January.
Video link. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Chancellor for coming to the House again to update us on the current situation and to congratulate him on the enormous amount of help that's been given to the British people throughout this pandemic. But could the Chancellor tell us how the country is going to pay for that support?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend asks an excellent question. In the short term, we are paying for this through extensive borrowing, and he will see that this year our debt to GDP will rise to roughly 100%. We are also carrying a significant ongoing borrowing requirement that is evident in the forecasts that have been seen. Now, that is not a sustainable situation. So as we continue to recover and grow, we will have to make sure that we reduce our structural deficit over time in line with the recommendations from the IMF to stabilise that. In the first instance, that will come through growth, but also we need to make sure that our public finances are balanced appropriately, ensuring that we can pass a strong economy on to the next generation.
Video link. Caroline Lucas. Caroline, we can't hear you. Caroline.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. Sorry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in reply to a question I asked the Chancellor back in September, he said those excluded from the self-employed scheme earned more than £50,000 and were in the top 5% of all earners. I would like him to admit today that that is not a fair picture of those who've been left out. Millions have been excluded who are not and have never been in the top 5% of all earners. So will he explain why he has deliberately left out so many people again when announcing this latest version of the self-employed scheme? And will he today finally commit to delivering justice for the self-employed?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about justice. We have spent over £14 billion to protect and support the self-employed, or over 3 million have been eligible for support. That is more substantial, comprehensive and generous than essentially any other country anywhere in the world. And today we've announced that that support is being increased in generosity and lasting longer, an additional £7 billion potentially being paid out in December. And I stand by what I said. One of the criteria for qualifying for the self-employment grant was that earnings were less than £50,000. Because we have less information about the self-employed, it was right to target that support on those who need it most. And of the people who are majority self-employed, those earning under £50,000 represent 95% of all of those people, and the average incomes of those over that £50,000 limit is about £200,000. So I think that is a reasonable and fair way to make sure we help the most needy in our society.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I commend the Chancellor on his statement. The incredible £200 billion worth of support this government has already provided has protected thousands of jobs in Blackpool South, and I know those businesses will warmly welcome the extension of the furlough scheme through to March. However, the reliance upon coastal communities such as my own on tourism in the years ahead will present particular challenges. So will he meet with me and my colleague in Blackpool North to discuss those, to make sure we can continue to keep this government's core ambition of levelling up on track in coastal communities?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for his local area and his local small businesses, and I know how important tourism and hospitality is to his local economy. He will know that I am also a champion of that industry, and I'd be delighted to meet with him and other colleagues.
Video link. Yvette Cooper.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Only a week ago, the government told West Yorkshire to go into Tier 3, and only a week ago, pubs and bar staff in my constituency were told their jobs were being completely stopped, same for them as under national lockdown. But when we asked the government to give them the full furlough scheme because their jobs were being stopped, the Chancellor said no. And the facts show when the jobs being stopped by COVID restrictions were just in the north, he just his defensive explanation that he got all the decisions right all along the way up till now. So can he explain now why 1 week ago jobs being stopped in my constituency were worth 13% less?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd say to the right honourable lady that, as I said before, all the interventions we have made apply on a UK-wide basis. They treat people the same, equally and fairly, wherever they happen to live. That will be the that was the case, that is the case, and that will always will be the case, and I can give her that assurance.
I'm, like others, hugely grateful for this massive programme of support for jobs and livelihoods, which is helping so many people, including in my own Chipping Barnet constituency. But it will all, in the end, have to be paid for. So will the Chancellor set out a plan to deal with the deficit and return the public finances to a sustainable footing for future generations?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and there will be a time when it is appropriate to do exactly as she suggests. I think given the uncertainty that exists at the moment, particularly with the economic forecast, it is difficult to do that with precision, and I think it would be inappropriate. But in a few weeks' time, we will have an updated set of forecasts from the OBR. They will illustrate the future direction of the deficit in public finances, and that will give us a sense of the task ahead of us and allow us to have a conversation about how over time to retain the public finances to the sustainable position that she rightly says they should be returned to.
Video link. Kate Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Businesses in Blackburn have been under additional restrictions since July and entered Tier 3 almost 3 weeks ago. Despite agreeing to give Lancashire local authorities £30 million in business support, equivalent to about £20 per head, the government is yet to provide a penny. Now that the country is going into lockdown, other areas are entitled to the same amount of support. It doesn't seem fair that businesses in Lancashire, Greater Manchester, South Yorkshire and Liverpool are entitled to the same amount as those areas that weren't under additional restrictions. Could the Chancellor explain the formula used to calculate the £20 per head business support grant, how long this funding is supposed to last, and whether areas that were previously in Tier 3 or may return to Tier 3 after the current lockdown can be expect an adjustment in the level of this grant to reflect the greater economic impact they are experiencing.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to tell the Honourable Lady that the business grants schemes that were outlined, up to £3,000 a month for closed businesses and 70% of that for open businesses, have actually been backdated for those areas that were experiencing heightened restrictions for some weeks and months before the tiering system was introduced. That funding will be backdated and I believe will be paid in cash to local authorities next week with the allocations given this week.
Steve Double.
Deputy Speaker, can I again thank the Chancellor for his willingness to be flexible to respond to the changing needs of our economy during this crisis, and thank him for the grants that will be made available to those businesses that are forced to close. But he will know that there will be many businesses in the supply chains that, whilst not forced to close, their revenues will be affected. So will he confirm that the money being made available to local authorities, I believe more than £5 million will be coming to Cornwall Council, is specifically to support these businesses, and that local authorities will be able to use their discretion to apply these funds specifically to meet the needs of the local economy?
My honourable friend is right in aggregate that the sum is over £1 billion for the country, with Barnet for devolved administrations, and that can be used at the discretion of local authorities to support their local businesses and local economy over the winter period in a way that they see meets their exact circumstances.
Video link. John Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, we welcome news that the Chancellor will keep the £20 universal credit uplift beyond next April. However, is he aware that this will still leave people seeking work £1,000 per year worse off than they were 10 years ago?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure entirely I understood the question, but I tell the honourable gentleman that the uplift in universal credit is temporary, but it is there in place until next spring. But more generally, to protect those who are the most vulnerable in our society, I would point him to the data that was released over the summer that showed that the suite of government interventions mean that the incomes of the lowest income households have been protected the most. That is a compassionate Conservative government looking after everyone in our society.
Video link. Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for extending furlough to March, and also for the cash grants for hospitality and other businesses that have had to close across my Colne Valley constituency. But will my right honourable friend please continue to look at what support he can give to freelancers, including musicians, company directors, and finally, will he please consider a beer duty cut to support my local microbreweries?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I know he's a champion for his local brewing industry. But future tax policy will be for budgets. But with regard to the self-employed, I think many of the people he mentioned will benefit from the increased generosity and timeliness of the self-employment support grants that we've announced both today and before. They will be paid out before the end of the year, up to a value of £7,500 per person.
David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've got to tell the Chancellor that the livelihoods of many Glasgow taxi drivers who are self-employed have been devastated in recent months. But I note on page 9 of his statement that he says that the income support grant for self-employed people will go through until January. Why won't it go through until March in line with furlough?
Mr Deputy Speaker, it will, but the precise amount will be a function. The grant will be there for a second one, although that's already been announced. There will be a fourth grant that will be payable in the spring. The exact value of that will be determined in January at the same time as we decide on the future furlough employer contribution, because those things generally align with each other. But there will be a fourth grant, and that has already been confirmed.
Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the extension of furlough, but the government has had since March to fix the gaps in the JRS and SEISS, which has excluded over 3 million individuals from support. This has caused huge damage to businesses and families. And as we enter the second lockdown, the Chancellor can still amend this by fixing the gaps which have been outlined extensively in this House. So, will the Chancellor commit to doing this? And what is his message today to those 3 million excluded? Yeah. What support will they be getting? Yeah.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, what the Honourable Lady refers to as a gap, as I've explained previously in answers, actually some of these are deliberate policy decisions to target support on those who need it most, and that's something that I think is the right and principal thing to do. I've also said clearly when it comes to the self-employed, I appreciate we haven't been able to help everyone in exactly the way that they would have liked, but across the suite of different things we've done, whether it's business rates, holidays, tax deferrals, bounce-back loans, improvements to our welfare system or housing allowance, there is something there that I hope can benefit the vast majority of the British people.
Video link. Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement my right honourable friend has made today and all that he's done to help businesses during this pandemic. Would he agree that today's increase of the third self-employed grant from 55 to 80% on top of the existing £13.7 billion support already provided means the support for the self-employed is one of the most comprehensive support packages anywhere in the world? Also, I believe the self-employed in my constituency of Bexheath and Crayford will welcome this further assistance that he's announced today.
Thank my right honourable friend, and I think he's absolutely right. It's something that we should be very proud of, that we have been able to step in and support over 3 million of those who are self-employed with comprehensive and generous support. That was the case at the beginning of this crisis, and it will remain the way all the way through to next year.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This morning I received a phone call from my constituent Hannah, who has a stall on the Lancaster Charter Market, which is an outdoor market. Herself and her business partner Hetty have been trading for just over a year. It's the second time their business has had to close in that short period. She would like to ask the Chancellor whether or not traders who trade on outdoor markets should be considered differently to other traders in order that these small independent businesses might have a chance to thrive.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, what I'd say to Hannah and Hetty is that if they are registered for business rates themselves, then they will be eligible directly for one of the business grants, up to £3,000 for every month that they are closed. But if they are not, and we found that many traders in covered markets were not, and that's why we provided previously discretionary funding to local councils, specifically to deal with the example that the Honourable Lady raised. So I hope that the council followed the guidance and was able to provide support to Hannah and Hetty. But that is why from the £1 billion of discretionary support we're providing to local councils now, they can hopefully provide the support to the Honourable Lady's constituents.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is a very welcome package by my right honourable friend, and particularly in relation to the self-employed, but I hope he will look again at some of the detail of the exclusions and definitions within the self-employed scheme, things like the definition of trading profits and other matters, which exclude some people, and will he also look at the position of the private and corporate events sector, who fall into a gap at the moment because they have not qualified, for example, for business rate relief because they do not sell food directly to the public but through their clients, and similarly have not qualified for VAT relief on similar grounds. But they're a critical part of the sector, worth many millions of pounds to the economy and employing some 600,000 people. Can he look to see what specific help can be given to them?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm always happy to hear suggestions from our honourable friend, particularly on improvements to technical language or drafting and guidance, and if he has some suggestions, I look forward to receiving them soon.
Video link. Maybe not.
1,000 people in Aberdeen were in receipt of universal credit. By September, this number had more than doubled to over 17,000 people. The Chancellor has made one spectacular U-turn today, so will he make another? Can he confirm that he will provide the funding necessary to maintain the £20 per week universal credit uplift beyond the spring?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, obviously the Scottish Government is due to outline a budget at some point soon, and with respect to future tax and welfare policy, I'm sure if that's something that the honourable gentleman and the Scottish Government think that they want to do, they have every tool and lever at their disposal to do exactly that.
Maybe a video link or an audio link, but Stephen Metcalfe.
Deputy Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for all that he's done during this challenging time to support jobs and businesses. And as you will know, this is tomorrow's Engineers Week. And as the former engineering envoy, I'm very keen to see our vital engineering sector to continue to thrive and prosper. Can he therefore tell the House what steps are being taken to ensure that the engineering sector have full access to and participate in the excellent Kickstart scheme to bring on the talent of the future?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for the engineering sector, and I know it's an area that he cares deeply about and has spoken to me about in the past. He's right. It's important that we train the engineers of tomorrow, and what better time than Engineers Week. I'd be happy to talk to him and other organisations that he would want to connect me with to make sure that that sector is fully benefiting from the opportunities we are providing for those companies to take on bright new people and provide them with a better future.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is a simple question to the Chancellor. Why does the Chancellor dress up on social media that the financial support, which as he stated today, is being given equally and fairly wherever they live, that the Welsh should be grateful for what is equally and fairly theirs to receive?
Mr Speaker, I think this is, as I said before, this is a United Kingdom approach. We have universal schemes that benefit people equally wherever they live. But on top of that, for those things that we do solely in England that are devolved, that extra funding, hundreds of millions of pounds I announced today, £5 billion in total for the Welsh Government, can be used as they wish to support their constituents. And indeed, I look forward to seeing how they plan to spend that money.
Dr. Kieran Mallon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My constituents understand the enormous challenges the government faces and that we cannot save every single job. But does my right honourable friend share my pride that the IMF has said that our response to COVID is one of the best examples of coordinated action globally, and they specifically praised our response for, and I quote, holding down unemployment?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. At the heart of our approach throughout this crisis has been to protect people's livelihoods. We have strived at every turn to make sure people can stay and work, that their incomes are supported. And as we go through this crisis, I can reassure every member of this House and the country that that remains my overriding priority, and we will throw absolutely everything we can at it.
Finally, Andrew Bowie.
Very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Unlike some of the more churlish comments from colleagues north of the border, can I thank my right honourable friend for listening and acting and demonstrating yet again, as it has throughout this entire crisis, that this UK government, this one nation Conservative government, acts for and supports people around this country, no matter in what region or nation they reside.
Yeah. Well, Mr Speaker, a fitting place to end, I think, Mr Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is a demonstration of the strength of the Union, an undeniable truth of this crisis, that we have been able to provide this level of economic support because we are one United Kingdom. Yeah.
I'd like to thank the Chancellor for his statement today in responding to 38 questions in just over 1 hour.